Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Do you know, I have a confession to make. I was invited on by Matt Chorley's team to play How to Get to Number 10, and I was too scared because I knew I had no hope of getting there. But it is the brilliant quiz, and Matt Chorley will be here after breakfast at 10 a.m. Let's look at the papers today, and two stories really dominating. First, that's the COVID inquiry. I mean, the Mirror have not held back at all. They've said, if you thought the government was incompetent and dishonest during the pandemic, turns out you were right. Now we know even their own advisors thought they were a tragic joke. We've just heard about what we learned yesterday. But then the latest in Israel and Gaza makes the front page of many other of the papers. The Daily Mail say, pawns of the terrorist. The Israeli Prime Minister has condemned the barbarians of Hamas as they parade three distraught women in a hostage video. It's sort of some of the psychological warfare at play right now. The Times says ministers were forced to overrule Foreign Office officials after they suggested excluding Benjamin Netanyahu from a landmark AI summit in Britain over Israel's invasion of Gaza. We'll look at the details of that now, because joining me to go through the papers is Andrew Eborn, barrister, broadcaster, the president of Octopus TV. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie. I'd vote for you, even if you didn't pass Matt Chorley's quiz. I think you'd be brilliant.
Oh, no, honestly, I've got one of those brains that just doesn't absorb I remember information for about 24 hours, and then a little later on it seems to have evaporated. And you know, when you go to a pub quiz and people think, oh, yeah, a news presenter, you're going to be great, on a huge asset on our team. And I think, well, I can provide enthusiasm and maybe a bit of panache, but actually no concrete answers. So I wasn't keen on doing the quiz, I have to say. Right. The Daily Mail, Andrew, just puts it so bluntly, pawns of the terrorists. This video of the hostages, what we're seeing is this extraordinary sort of propaganda war happening at the same time as the physical fighting.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely appalling. Every single day we're waking up to more and more tragic news coming out, and all sorts of apparent breaches of the Geneva Convention and the laws of war. I mean, the taking of hostages is prohibited under Article 34 of the Geneva Convention, and in the same ways you have to basically prohibit launches of attacks that may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life. And I think what's happened here, the Israeli Prime Minister is right to condemn Hamas as they parade three distraught women in the hostage video, and the condemnation of the world. And I think we need to put all of this into perspective, because there's a tragedy on all sides. And they always say that the first casualty in war is the truth. And lots of things, there are lots of questions coming out about this, but the human life, but remembering that every single thing behind this story, there are people involved, and it's absolutely appalling and deplorable.
Because what's happened is, really an escalation of ground operations in the Gaza Strip from Israel. And of course, that means there are real fears for civilians, of course, but also for the hostages. Well, Netanyahu said that it was cruel psychological propaganda, and the use of human shields would not deter Israel's forces. I mean, you kind of can't quite believe just how desperate a situation this has become.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right, Rosie. And I find it absolutely despicable, and it's appalling. And I think what's happened here, just how divisive the whole thing has been, right in the heart of London. As you know, I live just around the corner from the BBC. A lot of the marches start there. We had incidents of red paint being thrown at the BBC and on Jewish girls' schools and so on and so forth. The poison and prejudice that has polluted social media has spilled out onto the streets, and it's a real concern. And I always like to shine, as I say, more light and less heat on this sort of situation, and try to avoid the language of war. But on all sides, we have to respect human life, and the incidental loss of civilian life, and, as I say, having hostages, they are absolutely prohibited in what are called the laws of war.
What's going on in Israel and Gaza clearly with the attention of some civil servants. This is the story on the front page of the Times. But we know we've got this big AI summit coming up that the UK are hosting. And the analysis of the paper is that some of the civil servants thought that if Netanyahu attended, which obviously would be remote link, that could be a distraction. If he brought up the conflict, that could overshadow the Prime Minister who's hosting the summit. Ministers have had to say, look, no, we can't exclude the Israeli Prime Minister from the summit. You know, do you think the civil servants had a point, or do you think the ministers were right to say, no, it's ludicrous to say we can't invite him?
Well, the reality is it's ludicrous to make sure that people are excluded from the table. China's been invited to the table to discuss what is one of the biggest issues of our time. And if Rishi gets it right, then this will be probably one of his biggest legacies. I always say that artificial intelligence is our greatest human achievement, but potentially the biggest existential threat. And as you know, I speak around the world on the benefits, but also the risks of AI. We need to have an understanding, and we need to bring everybody together. AI knows no borders, and as a result, everybody must come to the table and work out a sensible way of trying to deal with it.
The other thing that may be a distraction rather than the AI summit will be the things we're learning in the COVID inquiry. And, you know, the Times says this morning that Boris Johnson made it impossible for the government to fight COVID because of his indecision into the public inquiry. That's what one of the civil servants said yesterday. Do you see these, you know, it's of course juicy. You're looking into people's private WhatsApps and their diaries to find out, you know, we really tried to get a picture of what they really thought. Do you see chaos or caution? Andrew, are you sort of angry at the government's response, or do you understand the chaos because it was such a unique situation?
I see both, actually, Rosie. I see chaos and caution and all sorts of lessons not being learnt. I think the reality is this, and I always warn that whatever you say, whatever you do, work on the basis that it's always going to get into the hands of the people you least want it to. So all these private WhatsApp messages and so on and so forth, they've managed now to obviously track down some of these, and it's not looking good. The latest details from the COVID inquiry, it takes up a number of papers, the Daily Mirror's front pages. It says it's a tragic joke as to how it was dealt with. And you've got all sorts of suggestions. You know, we had the thing about Dominic Cummings and his 264-mile trip from London to Durham, where despite having virus symptoms, and the potential cover-up that there may have been regarding that. All of these things are going to come out, and indeed we knew they were going to come out. It's a tragic desperation, if you like, as to how people should have handled things. But certainly there's a generation, it's affected all sorts of people. Lockdown was a huge impact on people, but also in the education sector. Children have lost all sorts of things for those relevant years. And that impact will be felt for many years to come.
What do you think about the decision to close schools, Andrew?
I think the reality is that I am not a scientist. And I think that this whole thing that they kept on peddling out about, well, we're going to listen to the scientists. And it turns out, well, they may not have listened to all the advice from the scientists. It is not good. What you're trying to do in any of these sort of things is base it on the evidence. I like to surround myself with experts and rely on those experts, make sure there's alternative views as well, so you can try to come to a rational decision. The biggest problem that we have in society generally at the moment is that everybody's become an expert. We're expert virologists, we're experts on constitution, we're experts on war, and the reality is we're just merely pandering to our own prejudices, and people try to find evidence that supports their own particular views. And I think the trouble is we're living in a very diseased information age, and I think the more we can question everything and try to keep an open mind, the better. But I always try and get my information from lots of different sources. I'm trying to work out what I don't know what you would do, Rose, but in that sort of situation, you want to speak to the expert and say, look, what is the best thing to do?
Well, that's what the government were trying to do at the time, and now it's all being picked over in the inquiry, and we'll find out lots more, I expect, today when we hear from Dominic Cummings. If you've been made very angry by the comments that we've heard about particularly Boris Johnson's conduct, well, hotheads get ahead. I'm looking in the Times here. Anger apparently aids problem solving. Researchers found that people tended to do better at tests of mental agility after they'd been subject to an experience that was designed to make them cross. I was slightly surprised by this, Andrew.
Well, I good old Johnny Rotten, anger is an energy. I love it. Jane Austen, she wrote in Pride and Prejudice that angry people are not always wise. But it was a very interesting survey which they did, and they made a few 1,000 participants. They had different ways of making them angry, including asking them questions and basically telling them, even though the answers were right, they were telling them that they were wrong. And so people got frustrated.
What they then did is they...
a bit annoying. And what they found out is that in one test, angry participants, they scored 39% higher when asked to solve things like anagrams. So clearly there's something within the human psyche. When you're angry, you seem to do a little bit better at problem solving. But it is interesting. There's all sorts of studies which go on about these sort of things. They also believe that the results support the idea that bad moods can be a force for good. The quote is, people often prefer to use positive emotions as tools. Our research adds to the growing evidence that a mix of positive and negative emotions promotes well-being, and that using negative emotions as tools can be particularly effective in some situations. Wow. So interesting. So anger is indeed an energy, and I think you have to work out, maybe that's important because you're getting all sorts of intellectual juices flowing as a result of it, in the same way as it's that flight or fight sort of mentality, isn't it? Which is the sort of animal instinct, and this is what we need to do. Need to work on that sort of basis.
I'm sure there's some sort of cultural differences here as well, because I worked in France actually for 2 years when the pandemic hit, which was kind of an extraordinary experience because we had a much more sort of, I think draconian would be the right way, lockdown. But working in France was so interesting because where we're all sort of the British, extremely restrained and polite in meetings and maybe don't tell our colleagues exactly what we think. In France, the culture is to say what you think and get really angry about it. And anger isn't seen as we would here in the UK as if someone got really angry, we'd sort of see that as a loss of control. Maybe you kind of think much worse of your colleague. In France, it's saying, look, I'm passionate, I care about this. Why don't you if you're angry? So it was extraordinary to have the kind of culture clash of the Brits working with the French, particularly in a busy newsroom. It was quite amusing.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I share that view. It's rather like a pressure cooker, isn't it? And you'd find a lot of nations, and they are suppressed and not allowed to show their emotions. They have the most extreme ways of letting their hair down. So I do think, and actually they say in relationships, it's much better to vent your anger in a particular situation so you don't brood about it for ages and ages and then suddenly have the most massive explosion. So I would always encourage people to share emotions.
Andrew, thank you so much. Andrew Eborn, barrister, broadcaster, futurist, president of Octopus TV. Really appreciate your time. Let me know your perspective on what we're learning from the COVID inquiry. Some of the claims are quite, well, they sound extraordinary. The Prime Minister apparently at one point said, well, not apparently, it was reported yesterday in the inquiry that talking about lockdown, he said, why are we ruining the economy for people who die soon anyway? When you hear these things, are you angry about how the government handled the pandemic? Or do you think maybe there should be a little bit of a little bit of leeway, that we're looking at this all now with the benefit of hindsight? They didn't have that. Let me know what you think. Do you see all of this as absolute chaos or caution? Let me know. You can text me 87222, start your message with the word Times. Right now, though, 5:32. Let's get an update on the day's news with Cara Bentley.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.